From Science Direct, National Computer Literacy in 1980 by Ronald E. Anderson. And to quote, "The term computer literacy shares the semantic ambiguity of language literacy as a communication with computers via a computer. Language is directly analogous to interpersonal communications via ordinary language. The conjunction of computer and literacy has had an intuitive appeal. There is also a great deal of knowledge about computers to be acquired, so it is appropriate to use the term computer literacy to refer to varying levels of this knowledge." It's become more of a common knowledge that in 1985, classroom models of computer literacy began to resemble today's definition, and that's thanks to the meeting in Virginia that occurred that gave us the previous quote from Ronald F. Anderson. And by looking at this article by Mark Hoffman and Jonathan Blake in 2015, we can gather more information regarding the definition of computer literacy and how it has changed in the year of 2015, the time Mark Hoffman posted this article. However, much of this information can be gleamed at as irrelevant due to the fact that in 1993 to 1994, you had cyber literacy pop up, and in the previous video, I argued back and forth with myself whether cyber literacy and computer literacy are one and the same. However, looking at the definition, it is becoming more and more obvious that cyber literacy and computer literacy are not one and the same. We now recognize the term computer literacy or computer literate as it would be described by Computer Hope in 2018. Computer literacy, and I quote, describes a general knowledge of computers, software, and hardware and how they work. Although this proficiency is important, it may not necessarily qualify an individual to work with a specific computer-related product. Computer literacy usually refers to the ability to run and navigate applications rather than to be able to program. With that modern information in mind, we need to take a look at Mark Hoffman and Jonathan Blake's previous statement. By 1987, computer application had improved to the point where the ability to use them implied computer literacy, word processing, spreadsheets, business and presentation, graphics, and file management became the core computer literacy topics. Because PC applications had grown easier to use, companies began to view them as a productivity or even employment requirements. In the year 2000, Literacy in the Cyber Age by R.W. Bernsky was published, and this book actually created the terminology for cyber literate, which is a conversation of your literacy with the online demographic. Coming from Britannica.com, Internet, a system architecture that has revolutionized communication and methods of commerce by allowing various computer networks around the world to interconnect, sometimes referred to as a network of networks. The Internet emerged in the United States in the 1970s, but not become visible to the general public until the early 1990s. By 2020, approximately 4.5 billion people, or more than half of the world's population, were estimated to have access to the Internet. And that number is growing largely due to the prevalence of smart technology and the Internet of Things, where computer-like devices connect with the Internet or interact via wireless networks. These things include smartphones, appliances, thermostats, lighting systems, irrigation systems, security cameras, vehicles, and even cities. At the introduction of my previous video, I declared that I am literate with computers, as I comically point out if you like a Facebook video, a YouTube video, or anything like that. However, much of this can be argued that it would fall into the cyber literacy and an understanding of how internet and things work. SEO, click-through rate, CTR, that kind of stuff, all falls in line with cyber literacy. And that cyber literacy would then fall into a YouTube literacy niche, because we don't broadly define many of these topics today, as we have separated many of them into their own use cases. So that raises the question, are you computer literate? In May of 2018, authors Saida Mammadova and Emily Pawlowski, I apologize for pronouncing those incorrectly if I did, for the American Institutes of Research, or the U.S. Department of Education, released Stats in Brief, a description of U.S. adults who are not digitally literate. I wanted to take a look at this and see what their arguments were. But before we could do any of that, we need to understand what they mean by digital literacy. We have talked about computer literacy, cyber literacy, and now we're moving on to digital literacy, which means we now have three different definitions that we need to take a look at and understand the dichotomy of in order to then understand if we are computer literate or computer illiterate. A Google search, digital literacy, is defined as digital literacy is an individual's ability to find, evaluate, and communicate information by utilizing typing or digital media platforms. It is a combination of both techniques and cognitive abilities in using information and communication technologies to create, evaluate, and share information. While digital literacy initially focused on digital skills and standalone computers, the advent of the internet and the use of social media has resulted in a shift in some of its focus to mobile devices, similar to other evolving definitions of literacy that recognize the culture and historical ways of making meaning. Digital literacy does not replace traditional methods of interpreting information, but rather extends the foundational skills of these traditional literacies. Digital literacy should be considered a part of the path towards acquiring knowledge. Taking a look at Western Sydney University, what is digital literacy? They define digital literacy as a means of having the skills you need to live, learn, and work in a society where communication and access to information is increasingly through digital technologies like internet platforms, social media, and mobile devices. So, by that logic, this digital literacy would fall into place with cyber literacy, or a modern version of cyber literacy. So this doesn't really help us understand what computer literacy is, but it is very important to understand why I had that dichotomous reaction when discussing it in my previous video. I was stuck between understanding what they meant by computer literacy as it has been broadly defined since the early 1990s, and in the year 2000, cyber literacy and then later digital literacy replaced it in the conversation at large. Taking a look here at air.org, figure 14, we can see that 81% of the United States populace are considered digital literate. Now, where this becomes a problem is the question of computer literacy, because what defines computer literacy is considered pretty old, coming from the 1980s up to about 2000 in the research that this video provides. There's, of course, way more information for you to delve into. I read these articles pretty much all the way through, and it is pretty fascinating. However, when I take and aggregate all the information that I have, I think it's pretty clear to say that 81%, if not more, are computer literate. As you enter many colleges and as you enter many workplaces, a computer is pretty normal. If it's an iPad, if it's a smartphone, if it's a computer, typically a lot of people have a pretty good understanding of what you are handing them and how to use it. And even those who would fall into computer illiterate status are probably still people who recognize and understand how to use a smartphone for basic applications in a cyber literate way. Things like applications in order to use Facebook, in order to use Reddit, in order to use YouTube. This is all what I would define as cyber literacy. Computer literacy seems to be leaning much more towards the graphical user interface, or the interface that you interact with directly, not online. So it's a question of, do you know how to use a spreadsheet? Do you know how to paint a picture in a application? Do you understand word processing? Do you understand graph making? Do you understand PowerPoint? Going back to all the information before, I would still argue that the majority of people are computer literate, but we still need to talk about our kids becoming more computer illiterate, but still cyber literate and still digitally literate. To do that, we first need to take a look at modern articles, and this one comes from itpro.com under the business/careers and training, and goes as followed. Please note that this highlights, and I quote, "The lack of literacy in computing means that there's a problem with productivity. People just don't have the skills to do the work that's required. And when you compound that with the technology knowledge that someone would need to have to spot things like cybersecurity issues, we are really fundamentally holding the ship under the waterline." quote, engaging with the toolkit that most companies will have. It'll either be Google Workspace or it will be Microsoft Office, and that doesn't track very well to the experience on the mobile phone and the tablet, and I can't see that actually getting any better, end quote. Quote, if we have a culture where it is acceptable to attend work and not have a clue about how to use the equipment, and we are supporting that culture, we've got to break that culture down, end quote. Coming from ItPro again, additionally, the UK is facing a major shortage of talent in cybersecurity, big data analytics, and technical architects. According to a recent DCMS report, the recruitment pool for cybersecurity professionals has a shortfall of 10,000 people a year, despite being the most sought-after tech skill in the UK. The shortage of developers, which has been identified amongst the 3 jobs with the worst skills shortages in the UK, behind HGV drivers and nurses, saw the biggest increase compared with previous years. So essentially what they're saying is less and less people are being in that job market. The shortages are set to impact businesses' growth, according to Harvey Nash, with 2/3, 66% of digital leaders in the UK now unable to keep pace with the change because of the dearth of talent they need. Dearth meaning lack thereof. Once again, this article seems to be trying to communicate something about computer literacy, but instead is focused more heavily into the programming and understanding of applications, which does not fall into computer literacy since this involves a much more profound knowledge on how a computer functions. As we saw from the definitions previously, you could see that the definition of computer literacy typically comes from how to use a computer in a general aspect. It seems ItPro is using computer literacy here to once again argue the incorrect point. This seems to be discussing more of a cyber understanding or a cyber literacy as well as a digital literacy, which comes from something like a more profound educational system. By looking at the nces.ed.gov article here, Figure 1, Average Computers and Information Literacy, CIL, scores of the 8th grade students by education systems in 2018. Looking at the United States, you can see that we hit a 519 above the ICILS 2018 average. So by this, arguably, United States is far more computer literate, and we don't even see the UK on here. So computer literacy might be a problem, but it's certainly not here. Coming from ons.gov, as you can see on this graph here, I probably pointed the wrong way. The majority of people in Great Britain in 2018 were using computers for sending and receiving emails, finding information about goods or services, internet banking, social networking, YouTube, listening to music, watching internet stream TV, looking for health-related information, watching videos on demand from commercial services, making video calls, playing games, selling goods or services, making an appointment with a healthcare practitioner. When we begin to define and look at things in a census medium, it's important to take into consideration biases and how questions are asked in order to push a group of people into a specific market. It's very clear to me that a lot of nations take internet very seriously, computers very seriously, and are taking steps to educate their populace on computer literacy, digital literacy, and cyber literacy. Since these all fall into different categories, each person can have their own different range values on where they fall on this level. And I would say the majority of people are computer literate. As we saw from some of the graphs in this video, I would say 81% of people are probably computer literate, and they might not be digitally literate, or they might not be able to go that far in order to understand programming, understand how computers fully function. The majority of people that I speak to that I would probably have considered computer illiterate generally have a okay knowledge on how to use a computer, and they don't know what's in a computer or how it works. However, in the definition, as you saw, it doesn't seem to really matter as long as you have a general understanding of hardware. So that narrows everything down to a pretty easy understanding of what a computer literate person is. Computer literacy is not something that is easily defined. It doesn't really seem to have a very strong scientific purpose, as its entire intention in the 1980s was a way to bring computers into the classroom in order to educate people on how to use them for employment opportunity. Later, the personal computer became much more popular, and Windows graphical user interfaces, DOS graphical user interfaces, Mac graphical user interfaces, Linux graphical user interfaces all became more relevant. As these things popped off, it seems like the terminology for what is computer literacy changed into digital literacy, as a understanding and the ability to grasp computers as they change became more relevant. And cyber literacy is just that, for people who are actively online. By this, I would say computer literacy as a whole is a redundant statement, and the term digital literacy is more relevant as it encompasses a larger market.
Okay, so what is the $64,000 question? Holy cow, I'm gonna have to tough it up now. Here we go. What's the $64,000 question for the field? What is the most asked question that I've received this week? What the hell are we supposed to do about .NET, Steve? It's a very good question, and it's got a very, very clear answer. Developers. The key to .NET, the key to industry transformation, the key to success is developers, 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 developers. Developers, 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 developers.
Steve Ballmer at .NET presentation here, and I think it's really important to understand that computer literacy is definitely on the rise. It has been on the rise for a long time. It would appear to me that a lot of the youth have a greater interest in computer technology, and the sub niches of digital literacy is becoming much more relevant as well. People might just want to use their computer for artwork or video production or video games, and that's perfectly okay. A lot of this conversation seems to be stemming from that of a employment bias, that being the use of specific applications or understanding of specific applications that are typically used in what would be considered a employment or organization or corporate level. Things like Excel and Microsoft 360 and all of those other applications. I stand to my point that a lot of people are, in fact, computer literate, and I don't see any reason to change that opinion. I think digital literacy is on a downtrend because we have become more and more open and accepting of how the internet functions and what we can put out there. We're much more comfortable with the state of the internet and our existence on it, that we are able to be much more public, where in the past we had to be much more cautious. Due to the explosion of things like security and the convenience factor that computers are able to provide, it does make sense to me that a lot of people maybe don't understand how to use the full extent of something like Windows, Mac, or Linux, as I stated in my previous video. But none of that really seems to be relevant to the conversation of if you are computer literate or what computer literacy is. I personally vote that the statement of computer literacy should just go to the wayside, and the term digital literacy should be used in its place, as digital literacy seems to encompass cyber literacy and computer literacy both at the same time. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned something or made you think about something. And with that, I will see you in the next video.